Welcome back to Ellie 2.0 Radio and Podcast. And welcome back. I'm Ellie Krug, welcoming you. I know, your favorite idealist in the world. And we're thrilled to have you once again, where we will talk about idealism and idealists. And although for this show we're going to take a slight detour because we're going to talk about a different kind of subject in the big interview. So hold on, I'm just giving you a little bit of a teaser here, okay? But we have a journalist, Ava Kian, who's going to come, a young journalist who you're going to like a great deal, who's going to come and talk about suicide. All right, so yeah, that was the teaser, and I just told you. So there you go, okay? And here in Greater Minnesota, and it's a fascinating. She did some research, and she's got a fascinating report that you'll like in the interview, okay? And by the way, suicide's a hot topic, and so I want to make sure that I cover it. All right, okay. And as usual, in my C block, I'll talk about my work as an idealist. There you go, okay? However, you're in the A block. This week's featured idealist is someone referred to as the mother of the civil rights movement, a woman who worked behind the scenes and who organized groups and movements. But it's not someone that you really know. She was a doer. Do you know what a doer is? I know you know what doers are, okay? These are people that just get it done, okay? And very often the doers do not want to be recognized. The doers just want to get it done. She was very much a doer. And yes, leaders are important, okay? All right? But it's the doers of organizations who actually make things happen. And our idealist, okay, our doer, Ella Baker, was a doer extraordinaire. Now, who was Ella Baker? Well, to begin, she was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1903. Her grandmother had been an enslaved person, okay? So she is first-generation past enslaved person her grandmother had been whipped and abused while she was enslaved. Apparently, the enslaver wanted her to marry another, enslaved person, the grandmother to marry another of the enslaved people, a man, and the grandmother did not want to marry him, and so the enslaver abused her and whipped the grandmother, okay? So hearing this, okay, and other stories about her grandmother being enslaved instilled in Ella Baker, okay, a strong sense of justice and the need to rail against injustice. And a little bit, we're going to play a clip, and you're going to know exactly what I just said. You're going to know exactly about her railing, okay? On top of that, when Ella was just 6 years old, all right, there was a race riot in Norfolk where whites attacked blacks. And that caused Ella's family to move from Norfolk, Virginia, to North Carolina. And certainly you get a sense of how this idealist was shaped by just even those experiences. Now, eventually, Ella went through high school and then attended Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she graduated as valedictorian. Now, after college, Ella Baker went to live in Harlem in New York City. So this would be in the 1920s, the latter part of the 1920s, where the beginning of the Great Migration to the north from the south. And once Ella Baker moved to Harlem, she began to work for the Negro National News. I mean, this was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ability. And she goes and she works for one of the major national black newspapers. And soon she was befriending many future leaders and activists. By 1938, she was working at the NAACP as a secretary. But before long, because she was a doer, she was traveling to the South recruiting members for the NAACP, organizing NAACP chapters in the South. And that organizing was incredibly important because those chapters would come into play in the 50s and in the early 60s. She was recruiting members for the NAACP, raising money, and getting the work done. She was also an egalitarian, and she pushed the NAACP to decentralize its leadership structure so that its local members had more control and power. She was also not good with male leadership. She wanted women to have more power. And this would be a theme for much of Ella Baker's professional life, a strong preference for believing in the power of grassroots organizing versus giving all the power to a leader. As I said, almost always, the leader was a man. And that man may or may not have the greater interests of the organization at heart versus the man's ego. Eventually, Ella Baker would organize leadership conferences in the cities of Atlanta and Chicago. And by 1952, she was president of the NAACP's New York City branch, working on school desegregation and police brutality issues. As she did this work, she tried to streamline the bureaucracy and give women more power, as I've already said. Later, Ella Baker would work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, and became involved in voter registration drives. So in the late 50s, early 60s, she's now starting to work with students and starting to work with them about like lunch counter desegregation, about how to train the students to go to the lunch counters, to be nonviolent, to take the abuse. We've all seen the pictures from the 60s of young black men and women sitting at lunch counters stoically as white people abused them, poured sugar or water over their heads, all of that stuff. That was Ella Baker training them to be nonviolent. Ella Baker met Dr. King, but it turns out she wasn't a fan of Dr. King, saying that he was a better orator than Democratic crusader. Again, she was her own person. And she was not, obviously, afraid of powerful men. Ella Baker's crowning achievement was helping SNCC, as I said. And as I said, SNCC became the backbone of the student sit-in movement that sought to desegregate. She later became known as the godmother of SNCC, and in that role she was a teacher and mentor to such greats. And so here are some names you will know, as Julian Bond, Diane Nash, Stokely Carmichael. So Ella Baker was their mentor. In the late 1960s, Ella Baker started to have health issues, and she returned to New York City where she was promoting socialism as an alternative to capitalism. In 1972, she traveled the U.S. working to free Angela Davis, who had been arrested out in California and been charged with murder and kidnapping. She went around the country, speaking about the need, that how Angela Davis was innocent, she had been framed, and later on it turned out that Angela Davis also was acquitted of those charges. Ella Baker also believed that Puerto Rico, this is a woman for all seasons, that Puerto Rico should become independent. And what follows is a clip that's going to give you a sense of this Ella Baker, okay? She gave a short speech at a Puerto Rico solidarity rally in 1974. Now, but first, before you hear the clip, and I want my listeners to listen carefully to what I have to say, okay? I need to give you a trigger warning because Ella Baker uses the N-word in her talk that you're going to hear, okay? So be aware of that. Now, she's a black woman. She's a black activist. She uses the N-word in a way to make a point, okay? But nonetheless, just trigger warning, I want you to be aware of that. Okay, Brett, go ahead and play the clip, please.
Friends, brothers, and sisters in the struggle for human dignity and freedom, I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years, a struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born. I have had about 40 or 50 years of struggle, ever since a little boy on the streets of Norfolk called me a nigger. I struck him back, and then I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done. A nice gathering like today is not enough. You have to go back and reach out to your neighbors who don't speak to you. And you have to reach out to your friends who think they are making it good and get them to understand that they, as well as you and I, cannot be free in America or anywhere else where there is capitalism and imperialism until we can get people to recognize that they themselves have to make the struggle and have to make the fight for freedom every day in the year, every year, until they win it. Thank you.
Wow. I always love hearing idealists speak. And boy, was that an idealist at work, talking about the struggle for human dignity and freedom, a 40 to 50-year struggle. Now, in the movie Rustin that came out last year, the actress Audrey McDonald portrayed Ella Baker in that movie. You may remember that, okay? Now, as I said, the key to organizing is having doers. Thank God Ella Baker showed up for the civil rights movement as a pivotal doer, an idealist. And one more fact about Ella Baker. She died on December 13th, 1986, which happened to be her 83rd birthday. She died on her birthday. And maybe that was just a wonderful way to bookend this incredible idealist's life. So there you go. Ella Baker, read up on her, learn more about her. Okay, there's a lot about her. And she was on a U.S. postage stamp at one time. And so there you go. All right, when we come back, we're going to do the big interview. We're going to talk about suicide in greater Minnesota. And you'll be, I think, surprised by some of the things that you're going to hear in terms of data and the disparities in terms of resources for people in greater Minnesota experiencing mental health issues. You're listening to me, Ellie Krug, one of the relatively few radio hosts who happens to be transgender, but I'm sure the only idealistic transgender radio podcast host in the world. We'll be back in a second. Thanks. And we're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio. And now it's time for the big interview. And I am thrilled that we have Ava Kian here. She is a writer for MinnPost. And I asked Ava to be on the show because she wrote this incredible story on March 19th. It was published by MinnPost. It's titled, Study Identifies Higher Rates of Suicide in Some Remote Minnesota Regions. And Ava, as you and I have discussed before having you come on, and which my listeners know, I have a particular interest in the topic of suicide because I lost my father to suicide in 1990. And, of course, I pay attention whenever there are other suicides that come, into my radar. And so, Ava, talk to us a little bit about the study and about your reporting, because you did not only the study, but you did some research. You went and interviewed various people. So go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, so this was based off of a conversation held by the Center for Rural Policy Development, and they're a think tank based in Mankato. And they basically held a conversation talking about rural suicides, the epidemic, and how common suicides are in different rural areas. Their study looked at which regions were being affected by it the most and what some of those reasons might have been. They pointed out the northeast and northwest parts of the state as having those higher rates, and then the Twin Cities 7-county metro having lower rates.
And I found that very interesting because I would have thought the stress of living in an urban environment would be more, telling on people, would be more on people, and that maybe their ability to cope would be less. What did the researchers and the academics theorize is the reason for the higher rates of suicide in greater Minnesota, in rural Minnesota?
Yeah, there's a lot at play there. One of which is, access to firearms. So there's higher access in rural areas, which oftentimes can result in more suicides. Other reasons were, the types of jobs that people work in rural areas. Sometimes they're more physical labor. And then access to mental health. There's a great mental health care provider shortage all across, but also in rural areas. And it just hits them harder since not many people are going to these rural areas to practice and work and stay and work there.
Well, and the statistic that you got from the center was that in 2023, the most densely populated counties, which would be, of course, like the Twin Cities and maybe, Olmsted County, where Rochester is, and St. Louis County, up with Duluth, that in the most densely populated areas, that there's a licensed healthcare professional that could deal with mental health issues leading to suicide. There was one professional for every 197 residents, but once you get out into greater Minnesota, the number is staggering. There's only one mental health care professional for every 741 residents. My God. And what did you find that maybe how they were trying to cope with this?
Yeah, so a lot of organizations are trying to increase that number. The U of M recently launched they're going to have a new medical school in St. Cloud to try and ease some of that provider shortage. But a lot of it also comes down to having providers who do have that rural understanding. That was also mentioned in this conversation, making sure there's cultural competency where, if it's a small town, maybe some people don't feel comfortable talking about their mental health with their provider
Right.
because they might know them really well. So having a provider who can sometimes tell some of those signs without it clearly being a mental health conversation that could have stigma attached to it.
What else did you discern or glean from all of the research that you've been able to review?
Yeah, I think something that was really interesting to me was the connection between 988, the suicide hotline number, and people who were then committing suicide. The report found that a majority of people in those rural areas are not actually reaching out, are not calling 988. And most of the calls from 988 are in those metro areas, while the suicides are not reflective of that either.
So we should let the listeners remind them, because this 988 number is fairly new, that about a year and a half, maybe at most 2 years ago, that across the nation, just like you have 211, which is information and referral, right? Or 911, which across the nation, wherever you are, you dial 911 and you know that you're going to get an emergency responder, that 988 was a new development aimed at providing some type of telephonic health care or mental health care response to people who are depressed, but particularly people who are contemplating suicide, right?
Yeah, so there are call centers around the state, and people will call, and they can actually track what county or where that phone number is coming from. And since its implementation, there's been a really big increase in the number of calls from when they shortened the number. I believe it was, I did some reporting earlier last year in 2022, and it seemed like from January to August of 2022, Minnesota call centers received around 23,000 calls, which was an increase of 16% from that same time range in 2021.
Okay. Yeah, but I would also expect that people would learn about 988 more easily in the urban areas with, billboards and with other kind of messaging, where in the rural areas they might not be as familiar with it.
Right.
So, but then we still get to the issue of people being willing to reach out for help, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, do you have any sense from, I guess for the lack of a better phrase, the stoic nature of our folks out in greater Minnesota. How do you think that comes into play?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stigma associated with reaching out to someone about your mental health. And then there are the barriers, too, of going and seeing a psychologist or seeing someone who specializes in that, right? That's not something that everyone can afford to do. It's not something that there aren't necessarily mental health treatment centers with beds available for all these people. So even just having that conversation is a first step. But once people sometimes will have that conversation, a lot of providers have mentioned, as they did in this call, that someone will go and share their story, and then they are stuck in that waiting room or the emergency department for a couple of days, not actually receiving that care, even though they've expressed that need and have overcome that stigma.
Right. So, again, we don't even have, if people come forward and if they are in crisis, we don't even have the beds, the facility for them. And I know from other sources, they're putting people into the emergency room, just leaving them in a bay in the emergency room, like for a day, until a bed opens up somewhere, or a bed may open up in some other county, and then somehow they've got to get from the bay to the other county to get the treatment.
Right. And there are many people who that just financially isn't possible for them too, right? They're missing out on work by doing that. They don't have work schedules that will allow for that. I think the rural landscape is not as well defined for that type of care. Yeah,
it's just so incredibly unfortunate. What else? Do you have anything else? Well, I guess the data also showed that the kinds of populations that were more prone to suicide. What did you find out about that?
Yeah, there's extensive research done in Minnesota that shows BIPOC people, people of color, Indigenous people, Native Americans especially, suffering from deaths of despair, which is a subsection of suicides. It also shows that, there are people across age ranges, too, who are suffering from mental health illnesses. And, in rural Minnesota, there are a lot of white people as well. Right.
Well, the LGBTQ community has a higher incidence of depression and suicide simply because of the social stigma that continues to exist, but particularly exists in greater Minnesota than it does in the Twin Cities or in our rural areas. When you say deaths of despair, can you define that for our audience?
Yeah, so deaths of despair are oftentimes alcohol-related, substance use-related deaths that, they fall into a category where sometimes it's hard for examiners to figure out what type of death that was, but they can connect it with some sort of despair in that person's life.
Where somebody's gotten so depressed, they just start drinking and they just don't care what the consequences of the drinking are.
Yep.
Right? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, so is there anything else from the studies that you think is important for the audience to hear? And Brett, feel free to jump in if you've got a question or a comment.
Gotcha. Will do.
Yeah. Something that, this wasn't quite from the study, but this was from someone who shared during that conversation. And it brought me a lot of hope thinking about what is our state doing to kind of deal with this high incidence in rural areas. There was a program called Bienvenidos, which means welcome in Spanish. And this program is basically bringing mental health community and conversation to people who are working in rural areas. And it's for Spanish speakers who are sometimes migrants here, and they don't have that community and infrastructure. So that's one example of people who have, they've noticed this is a need, and there's definitely people struggling who don't have that community around them and that infrastructure and the access to healthcare either. And programs like that are creating space for those people to have conversations about their mental health.
Have they launched that program, or is it still being created?
Yeah, there was one that took place last year, and then they are looking to partner with a new plant for this year, but they haven't started it yet.
Okay, all right. Well, this it's such a totality of action when someone ends their life. I mean, there's like no going back, no way to fix it after it ends, and I can just attest that the impact that it leaves on those who are survivors, those who are the loved ones, incredibly, incredibly difficult. And so I think we should remind the listeners right now that if they are experiencing a mental health issue, okay, if they are having, Ava, if they're having any thoughts about ending their lives, it's called suicidal ideation, that it's incumbent upon them to reach out, and this 988 number provides somebody, another human, a human who cares, a human who is trained to listen. It provides 988 provides some outlet for people who are thinking about taking their lives, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a reason, right? There's a reason that having a conversation can help, and I think a lot of times, them shortening the number has been a blessing because you can call whenever. You can always call.
Yeah. So, Ava, before we go, tell us a little bit about you. You've been writing for the MinnPost for a couple of years. And what got you into journalism, and what topics are your specialties? What do you like to cover?
Yeah, so I'm from Minnesota, born and raised. I began in journalism in a race and health equity role. So I was really focused on health disparities and racial disparities that we see within health in Minnesota. And now I just recently, starting in January, I began covering greater Minnesota. And there's a lot of intersections, right? There's a lot of connections to health disparities in greater Minnesota as well.
So how are you finding the beat different in greater Minnesota than in the metro?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more, there's more area, right? There's so much more space.
You're in the car a whole lot more.
Right, in the car a lot more for sure. And you're talking with people who have really differing opinions. I find that in the Twin Cities metro, sometimes it's a little bit more of a, when everyone has their own, they have similar thoughts. They kind of all get along a little bit in that. In greater Minnesota, I'm noticing that there are a lot of differences in opinion. And, even with something like suicides, the way it'll affect someone in the northeastern part of the state is very different than in southern parts of the state.
Give me an example of that.
Yeah, just the access to healthcare, right? Or the challenges that people in certain industries will face, right? Certain industries of the state are more like they have animal production and farming, and other areas might not have that, or might not have the resources and that financial ability either. So there's a lot more variance in terms of what I'm finding affects people, and that's something that has been interesting so far.
And have you found, though, that as you've done your work, that people are open to talking to you?
Definitely. People want to share their experiences. People want someone to look into what is causing them issues and what the good things too are in their community too. I think so much of this needs to be about the positivity that these communities have as well.
Well, my day job that pays the bills is going and doing workshops and speaking on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my belief has been that I need to do the work in greater Minnesota, not in the cities anymore. It needs to be out. And what I continue to find, even though I'm very diverse, as you can tell, is that people are very welcoming. They still are open, and they're willing to talk to me and be vulnerable in many occasions.
Yeah.
So this is a show about idealism. Okay, I hope it's okay if I say you are a young person, and you are magnetic. I will tell you that. Okay, your enthusiasm for your work is very apparent. So, do you consider yourself to be idealistic? To be an idealist, someone working to try and make the world better?
That's a great question, Ellie. I would say I definitely try to make the world better. That's the reason I'm in journalism, that I recognized there was a need for that early on from a really young age. Whether I would call myself an idealist, I don't really like labels as a whole. But I would say I stick really firmly to my beliefs and morals. And since I can do that in my job, I think it's just a perfect lineup to be able to do something that I truly believe in, and that can make a difference for the people I speak to and the people who read the work too.
Well, if I can just ask one more question along this line, how did you get that way? What made you want to make a difference?
Yeah, So my parents were Iranian American, and growing up in the U.S., it was a very tense political time, kind of post 9/11. And I recognized within the media too that there was a need for more diversity of thought. There was a need for people who didn't necessarily have that same viewpoint on everything. And I think my parents really instilled the values of these are our ethics. These are, you can grow and change within your ethics, but you want to be doing something that helps people at the end of the day. And luckily, Minnesota is a great place to go to school and to be in community. And it was great to foster that here.
Great. Thank you. Well, listen, Ava, it's been really wonderful to talk with you. And I look forward to seeing more of your reporting in MinnPost. And I look forward to maybe seeing what else you're going to do beyond all of that as a writer. So thanks for the work that you're doing, particularly out in greater Minnesota. And thanks for being on Ellie 2.0 Radio.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. It was a joy.
Okay, well, thanks. All right, well, listeners, we've been speaking to Ava Kian from MinnPost, who's wrote this incredible article on dated March 19th. Go to MinnPost and check it out. It's again, the title is "Study Identifies Higher Rates of Suicide in Some Remote Minnesota Regions." All right, when we come back, I'll do my C block and talk about my work as an idealist. We'll be back in a second.
She was lying in the grass. How long till my soul gets it right? Can any human being ever reach that kind of light? I call on the resting soul of Galileo, king of night.
And we're back. Ellie 2.0 Radio. Okay, so Ava Kian, okay, I hope we have her back on the show. She is magnetic, and I really enjoyed talking to her. And again, I cannot stress enough this thing about 988. Reach out to it. If you or a loved one is experiencing serious mental health issues, always ask if they're thinking about taking their life. And in the same conversation, make sure you relay the number 988. Okay? Please do that. All right, so my work as a idealist, okay, I've got a lot to report to you. So I had been promoting for a number of shows that I was going to speak in Delano, Minnesota, and I did that last Saturday, at the Delano High School. I did gray area thinking to I think we had about 45 people in attendance, and boy, did they like that. They really did. I had people who told me that they were moved. I had people come up to me and say, my husband never speak. My husband didn't even want to come to this. And he spoke. You touched my husband, Ellie. And I will tell you that the gentleman, when he spoke, he touched everybody else with what he had to say. So it was quite the success. And I'll just put a plug in. The person who helped organize this thing was a junior in high school. She negotiated the contract with me. She got everything organized, and I met her parents, and I said, your kid is going to be able to do just about anything in life, and she's already there at this point. So they appreciated hearing that. So that was wonderful to be in Delano. And my goal is, I hope, at some point soon, I can go 30 miles west of Delano, because Delano is about 45 miles west of the Twin Cities, and I just want to keep going west into greater Minnesota. All right, so 2 weeks ago, on another topic, I had Sarah and Elise here on the show, either 2 or 3 weeks ago. You may recall, they happen to be friends of mine, and they talked about how the three of us helped form this, the very first Pride organization in Carver County, a rural, red county outside the Twin Cities where we all live, how we had formed Carver County Pride. And I'm here to be thrilled to report to you that the organization has finally been incorporated. We had our first organizational meeting at my house on a Tuesday night over pizza and wine. I just had said wine, okay. And elected all the officers. I was elected to the chair of the organization. And I am thrilled to let all of you know, mark on your calendar, okay, August 31, because that will be the very first Pride event, official Pride event for all of Carver County. On August 31, we're going to hold it at the Carver County Fairgrounds, which sounds very appropriate, okay, in Waconia, Minnesota. So stay tuned, okay? But August 31st, we're going to put on our very first Pride event. Now, how big it will be, I don't know. How successful it will be, I'm positive, because we have a bunch of doers. I just got done talking about Ella Baker as a doer. We have a bunch of doers in the organization. So stay tuned, okay? But I'm thrilled to talk about that. And then, oh my gosh, it's been a week, On Delano, it was Saturday night, and on Thursday this week, I spoke at two places, not one, but two places on Saturday, in the morning and then in the afternoon. And one of my talks was to 400 people, the one in the morning. It was to an organization that has a group of all kinds of professionals. So we're talking therapists, some law enforcement, some corrections people, other folks on battling sexual assault and issues around sex addiction and things of that nature. As I said, I had a group of 400 people. I didn't know how they would react. And my talk was, Transgender 101, it's not a choice, because my concern with this group was that there would be a lot of people in the audience that would be believing, that would think that being trans is a choice. And, of course, if you believe it's a choice, then you believe that a transgender person, if they get maybe the right religion or they get the right therapy or they take the right drugs, could unchoose to be trans. And if you know anything about Ellie Krug, if you have read my book, Getting to Ellen, available on Amazon, Kindle, Nook, and Apple, you would know that it's not a choice. At any rate, I had some trepidation about going and speaking with this audience, and what I did before I spoke is we did a poll, and it had one question on it. Do you believe being transgender is a choice? And out of that group, we had 10% who said they believed it was a choice, and another 35%, this is before the talk, another 35% said that they were uncertain. So we had about 45% of the people in the room saying that they believed or were uncertain about whether it was a choice. That's probably among the highest percentages I've ever had when I've given this talk, because I do the polling quite often when I give the Trans 101 talk. Now, so I gave the talk. I tried to give them some examples of why it wasn't a choice. I talked from the heart, but also from the head. I got some engagement with the audience. And by the time we were done, we did the poll again. And I'm here to tell you, your idealist, your future, you're always idealist here, move the needle. Because we moved it from 10% of the audience saying, yes, it was a choice, to only 2%, moved it from those who were uncertain from 65%, from 35% down to 5%. And those who were certain it wasn't a choice moved from 65% to 93% of the audience. And I just got to tell you, as an idealist, as somebody trying to make the world better, as someone trying to change the world, that poll warmed my heart. It did. Because it was actual proof that maybe I was making a difference. So there you go. Okay. Interestingly, at the beginning, I also polled and asked the percentage of people who believed being gay or lesbian was a choice. And you know what? A far less percentage of people said that being gay or lesbian was a choice, like only 2%, compared to the 10% at the start of my talk who said that being transgender was a choice. Think about that and about how the discrimination goes, even within the LGBTQ community, that they're more accepting of some of the letters of the LGBTQ community, but not all. So I thought that was interesting. Okay? All right, now get on your radar if you want to come and see me speak. If I'm just trying to put this out there. Okay, I'm going to be doing Gray Area Thinking on the evening of May 5th. That's a Sunday. Okay, at Holy Trinity Methodist Church in Prior Lake. It's going to be open to the public. Of course, it's a church on May 5th. I don't have the exact time, but I'm going to guess it's 6 or 6:30. You can go to the church's website, or you can reach out to me at Ellie Krug at lejkrug@gmail and ask me, and maybe the next show I'll be able to tell you what exact time it is. But May 5th, Holy Trinity Methodist Church in Prior Lake, I'll be doing gray area thinking. Okay? All right. And then, so I tape the show on Fridays, so you hear it on Saturday. And later on today, this Friday, I'm going down to St. Olaf College, where I'm going to be speaking in Northfield. So this afternoon, I'm going to be doing gray area thinking for the college students. We'll see how many come for that, because it's going to be at 4 o'clock on a Friday. And if you're a college student, usually at 4 o'clock on Fridays, you're thinking about doing something other than something intellectually stimulating, okay? But we'll see. And then I'm going to be having dinner with some of the students. And then at 7 o'clock tonight, I'm going to be doing a talk, which is a soapbox talk. I don't usually get on the soapbox and rail about how bad it is for trans people in my talks, but I have a talk called Target on My Back, and it's about how there is a target on my back and on the back of all transgender people in America right now. You've heard me speak about all the laws. I think right now we're up to 521 this legislative season, 521 anti-transgender bills introduced in state houses in like 43 states across America. 18 of those bills have become law. So, yeah, you know. And just this week, introduced in the Missouri House is a bill to criminalize, to make a felony, anyone who helps a student, a young person, transition. So that would mean anyone who gives advice about pronouns, anyone who recognizes somebody's pronouns or name that aligns with their gender identity, anyone who says, boy, you look nice in that dress, even though they were assigned male at birth, that in Missouri, you can go to jail. It's a felony to do that. That's working its way through the Missouri legislature. Think about that, everyone. And if it passes, other states will follow. All right, I got to go. Okay, so you listening to me. I hope you like this show. I hope you tune in. Tell your friends about it. A big thanks to my producer, Brett Johnson, who helped again and again today and gives me wonderful advice off the air. And to you, my listeners, please, between now and when you hear my voice next, will you do me one favor? You know what I'm going to say, right? Go out and do something, maybe more than one thing, to make the world better. Will you do that for me, please? Okay, thanks. All right, till next time. Oh, next week will be a repeat. I won't be around. I've got to do another training. So, till 2 weeks from now, Ellie Krug, over and out.